TolkCast, a Tolkien podcast, presented by the German Tolkien Society. Interview special. Welcome to another episode of TolkCast. Normally, our podcast is in German, but every so often we meet great people who we interview. These sessions remain in the English original. To get to the regular podcast episodes and to the German translation of this interview, just follow the link in the description. The following interview with Brian Sibley was recorded in August 2019 during the international conference Tolkien 2019, hosted by the Tolkien Society in Birmingham. Enjoy the interview. I'm sitting here today with Brian Sibley, who it's just difficult to say what exactly it is you do because you do so many things. Most of you will probably know him as the author of several movie books, not only on Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, but also Harry Potter, and I can't even grasp it. It's so much. I've seen your name for so long before meeting you. It's really great to have you here. Thank you for joining.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Brian, starting with the easy questions, where do you come from?
I was born in London and I've lived in and around London all of my life.
And what's your favourite food?
Favourite foods. I very much like oysters. I very much like beetroot. I very much like marmalade. Yes, those are a few of them. Not together, actually. I don't think I don't think I've ever eaten marmalade, oysters, and beetroot together. But I like a lot of foods. It's easier to tell you what foods I don't like. I don't like aubergine. That's probably the main thing I don't like.
Okay.
But having said that, I quite like aubergine if it's cut very slim, very thinly, and then battered, and then deep fried, and then drizzled with honey. That's pretty nice, actually.
Okay.
But apart from that, I steer clear of aubergine.
Brian, if you're not working on any books or any movies or radio shows or whatever, what are your hobbies? What do you like to spend your time with?
I don't have any hobbies. No, it's true. I don't have any hobbies because, and I know this sounds a little bit maybe fanciful, but actually all my hobbies have provided me with the things that I do in my job. My jobs, because I've had lots of different things, writing books, writing plays, presenting programs, making dramatizations of books that I love. Almost everything that I've loved in my life has fed back into the things that I do. So I don't really have hobbies as such. If push comes to shove, I would say that one of my hobbies would be collecting. And I don't collect. I can't say, I'm a Tolkien collector, because I'm not. I've got some nice Tolkien connected books, certainly, but I collect autographs. I collect books that I love. Normally, they may be books that I'm passionate about, and I want to get them in a special edition. I am very, very keen to have one book of every author that I really am passionate about that's signed or inscribed by that author, and I've got a few of them. I don't have anything signed by C.S. Lewis, who is one of my heroes, mainly because C.S. Lewis is, as a collector, almost impossible to afford nowadays. But I have got an original edition, early, not first edition, of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland that's signed by the author, i.e. Lewis Carroll. And I've got signatures of J.M. Barrie and J.R.R. Tolkien and A.A. Milne and Walt Disney and many, many other writers and filmmakers and people, and musicians and composers and musicians whose work I admire. Many of them I've acquired by meeting the people and having them inscribe something for me. I have a copy of Roald Dahl's very first book, which was called The Gremlins. It's a book that he wrote for, was going to be animated by Walt Disney during the Second World War, but the film never got made. But Disney did publish a book with Roald Dahl's story about these little impish goblin characters who were thought to be the reason that pilots had accidents during the war, because they got in and interfered with the technology of the planes. And I met him for an interview, and he was a very cranky interviewee, so he wasn't the easiest person to talk to. But what happened was that I asked him to sign it, and it is quite a scarce book because it was published and it didn't get reprinted because the film never got made and so on. So he asked me when I was born, and I told him that I was born in 1949, and because the book was published in I think 1944 or 5, something like that, and I was born in 1949. So when he came to sign the book, he signed it for me and said, on your birthday, which was of course impossible because I was born after the book had been published. So I've got some quirky things like that. So that is a sort of a hobby. I like collecting with my husband, David. We collect artwork. We have lots and lots of artwork by different artists that some of it Tolkien, but we have lots of examples of cartoon art. We both of us love cartoons and caricatures, but we've got art by Pauline Baynes, one of the Tolkien illustrators, several pieces by her. We knew her as a personal friend. Eric Fraser, who also illustrated Tolkien, and lots and lots of other artists. So yes, our walls are covered with art. For a long while we used to keep our art in a store, and we would hang one picture and then take it down and put up another one. But now we decided we just hang it all. So anybody who comes to see us, you can't walk down any sort of path anywhere. Every wall has got 30, 40 pictures stacked up to the ceiling. So.
Oh, that sounds like a wonderful place.
So that is a sort of a hobby, really. But as I say, most of my hobbies are actually wrapped up in what I do.
Okay. If you were to send off to a deserted island, what would you bring with you?
Oh, what would I bring with me? Well, we have a program in Britain called Desert Island Discs, where you're allowed to have 8 gramophone records and a book. You already are given Shakespeare and the Bible, both of which I would actually want to have with me. It would be very difficult for me in terms of a book. I would want some books, I think. People who get asked this kind of question, they always say, "Oh, I'd like lots of blank paper and a typewriter, or a notebook and lots of pens." To be perfectly honest, if I was cast away on a desert island, I don't think I'd be doing very much in the way of creative writing. So I would want to, when I wasn't trying to survive, I would want to have things that I could enjoy. So I'd need several books. What's quite difficult for me would be which books to choose. Because I have lots and lots of favourite authors. And I also am very aware that there are some books that I know so well that I probably don't need the actual printed book in order to be able to relive it in my mind. A book like The Wind in the Willows or Alice in Wonderland, for example, or The Hobbit. I know the book so well that I could actually probably just sit there and tell myself the story. I wouldn't get it completely right, but I'd have the story. So I think I might go for taking some books that would be a challenge to me, something I'd never got around to reading. I'd have a lot of Shakespeare to read, and I haven't read certainly all of Shakespeare. So I think perhaps if I could have anything, I'd probably have the complete works of Dickens. I love Dickens' work passionately, but there are several of his books that I still haven't read, or I've only encountered as a film or a play or something of that kind. So yeah, I'll take the complete works of Dickens, I think.
It's a good choice in my mind.
Yeah.
Brian, you gave a talk here, a talk in 19, about the Hobbits and your travels in Middle-earth. And someone mentioned you gave an anecdote on Christopher Lee. So I couldn't attend, and most of our audience can't anyway. So would you be so kind to retell that anecdote?
Yes, of course. This is a story I as well as writing the books about the making of The Lord of the Rings and then later the Hobbit trilogies, I also wrote Peter Jackson's biography, and one of the stories that Peter told me when I was gathering material for the book was how he had been directing Christopher Lee for Christopher's scene where he played Saruman in The Two Towers, and it's not correct according to the book, but the way it was rewritten for the film is that Grima Wormtongue stabs Saruman in the back at the top of Orthanc, and Saruman falls to his death from the top of the tower. And Peter recounted how he had said to Christopher Lee, now when Grima stabs you in the back, I want you to give a big scream as you fall down the length of the tower. And it was a pretty high tower, Orthanc. And Christopher allegedly said to Peter, no, Peter, no, that's not what happens. If you're stabbed in the back, you don't scream. You can't scream because all the air in your body is just knocked out of you. So what you have is this exhalation of breath. And that's all you get, a kind of So that's what he did. And it looks very impressive in the film. So I published my biography of Peter with this story in it, and I had this telephone call. I was sitting in a local public house, an inn, having a drink and lunch, and the telephone rang, and I answered it, and the voice at the other end said, Brian Sibley. And I said, Christopher Lee, how are you? And he said, how did you know it was me? Well, I hesitated to tell him after all the years he'd been acting that his voice was totally unmistakable. And he said, no, I've been reading this book of yours about Peter Jackson's very good book, but you say in this that I claimed something in connection with this scene in the Two Towers. Well, what he claimed was that he knew this fact about people, what happens to people if you're stabbed in the back, because he had once been involved with the SAS, which is the basically the secret service in Britain. So these are the people who rush in, when there's a heist or a hijack or whatever. The SAS. So he said to me, you say in the book that I was a member of the SAS. Well, I wasn't exactly a member of the SAS. I was the SAS Reserve, which obviously means he wasn't quite there with the people with the balaclava helmets on who crash through windows and rescue people in embassies or whatever. So I said, I'm really sorry, Peter. Perhaps I could change this for you, in another edition. And then he said, no, there's no need to change it. Of course not, no, but I just wanted you to know the facts, and that I also wanted you to know that I have spoken to the head of the SAS this morning, just to make him aware of what's happened, so that there aren't any repercussions from it. And I said, right, yes, of course. And he then told me a very scurrilous thing about a member of the cast, which I can't repeat. And the reason I can't repeat it is, as I'll now explain, that he said to me, but you will not repeat that, Brian Sibley. If you repeat that to a single person, what I've just told you, then I will need to remind you that I may not have been in the SAS as such, but I know a great many people who are in the SAS. And of course, since that, I've never told whatever that story was that he told me. In fact, I've wiped it from my mind because I'm too terrified of these desperados rushing in and seizing me and tying me up and dragging me off to be questioned somewhere in a dark
deserted
hole.
line.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, that's a great story.
I loved him dearly. I thought Christopher Lee was a fantastic actor.
Yes.
He was incredibly pompous in many ways, but he was an actor who had implanted his image on so many roles. He didn't like people keep reminding him that he played Dracula. He really didn't like that. But of course it was the role that made him famous. But I think he was much more proud of the other things that he'd done, and I understand that. But for millions of fans all over the world, he is and always will be Dracula.
Yeah. He's really iconic, but I think your impersonation of his is truly fabulous. That's really great. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay.
Brian,
he'll probably get his own back. He's probably listening somewhere up in heaven, and I will probably get some interference on my phone tomorrow, and he'll be saying, Brian Sibley, what are you telling people?
I think that's a chance that's okay to take. Brian, when you were working on the movie books for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, what can we sort of picture? What did that work look like? So how did that come to be? How?
Well, the connection really was that I had done some books about the maps, Tolkien's maps of Middle-earth, with John Howe, and John Howe was working on the film with Alan Lee as two of the creative designers for the film. And I had a connection through Peter Jackson in that many, many years ago in 1981, I had dramatised The Lord of the Rings for BBC Radio.
Yes.
And Peter Jackson was well aware of that. He had the cassettes of it. And in fact, some people would say, I better not make the claim myself, but some people have said that there's quite a lot of references to what I did with the radio dramatisation in the structure of his film. But those things all just played together, really. And what happened as a result was that when HarperCollins got the opportunity to be able to do the books about the making of the film, I was one of the people who they approached and said, would you be interested in chronicling the story of the making of this, well, extraordinary, as it was then, an extraordinary project, for a pretty well unknown, I mean, he was not locally known, but not universally, certainly not globally known director, taking on the prospect of 3 big movies based on one of the most famous books in English literature. So it was a great opportunity and one that I relished, and I had such a brilliant time because everybody who was working on that film, they were very open, and they treated myself and the writer Jude Fisher, who was also writing books on the films, they treated us both as very much part of a team. So we had freedom to meet with everybody. You could walk into Nyla Dixon's costume workshop. You could wander around Weta and look at the sculptures and ask questions of people. Nothing was off limits. I had complete freedom. And what I decided to do very early on was to try and make it my journey through the studio, through the filmmaking, my journey of meeting these people, talking with them, they're asking questions, their answers, so that the reader would then be able to make that same journey. I have not been allowed to do this with every book I've written about movies. I would say, I'm not going to tell you the ones that I didn't have that kind of freedom, but actually it was pretty much all of them except the ones I did for Lord of the Rings. So it was a great privilege, and I always loved the fact that that particular book is called The Making of the Movie Trilogy. That particular book is often, many people refer to it as one that is special to them because it gave them the opportunity to be in New Zealand, be there where it was all happening, and I'm very proud of that. But it's not something personally proud of. It's to do with the fact that all of those people just were so willing to cooperate and be my friend on that journey.
I had the exact same reaction to that book too, because we were thinking about New Zealand, but it's so far away, right? Especially from Europe, and when the Lord of the Rings movies happened, I was a teenager, so unaffordable to go anywhere outside. Anywhere near. So that was really great to be a part of it without being there, really. So thank you.
Well, thank you.
This might be a bit of a weird question for a movie enthusiast and Peter Jackson, a movie involvement, but I think that the Hobbit movies are quite different in style and in the making, in the process of the making, than the Lord of the Rings movies. What's your opinion on that as a movie enthusiast?
Yeah, the Hobbit movies are very different from the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I think there's lots of reasons for that. There was a different studio relationship. Warner Brothers had much greater input into the way things were run. Peter Jackson had moved from being a relatively unknown filmmaker to being a highly bankable box office megastar. And the movie itself had gone through a very difficult transition. I think Peter had decided he didn't really want to do The Hobbit. I mean, the truth is that he had wanted originally to do The Hobbit and then do The Lord of the Rings. And that wasn't how that deal happened to get concluded back in the day. So I think once he'd let go of The Hobbit, and he knew that The Hobbit was such a different book from The Lord of the Rings. I mean, The Hobbit well, as we know from Tolkien, everything to do with Tolkien's history, that when he was writing The Hobbit, he had no idea of half of the ramifications of what was going on in that story and how they would play out in The Lord of the Rings. So it was a process of discovery, and it's a different kind of story. It's not weighed down with the same moral considerations that you get in The Lord of the Rings. You know, The Lord of the Rings is not just about the adventure story.
Yeah.
It's also about, you know, concepts like fellowship and sacrifice and good and bad, and how they conflict with one another, and how people can overcome them or try and balance them, and so on. So it's a lot more to it in terms of its substructure and the meaning and message to it. And therefore I think it was quite a problem that, having created what is, I think, still a legendary and quite remarkable interpretation of The Lord of the Rings, he then had to embark on what was, in many ways, a slighter story. You know, lovely story and a popular story and beloved by everybody who's ever read it, but it's not quite the same thing as The Lord of the Rings. And yet, at the same time, he was trying to put into that film all the other levels and layers that had come out of his Lord of the Rings filmmaking. So you had the situation that he now had to try and explain, when we're told in The Hobbit that Gandalf goes off and leaves the dwarves on the edge of Mirkwood. Well, we know that he was going off, as he later says, to deal with something connected with the necromancer, but and we know from Tolkien's notes that he went to the White Council to meet with the White Council. But of course Peter Jackson had to put in the White Council because he'd already established Elrond and Galadriel and Saruman as being major characters in the Lord of the Rings. So it was, how could he not include the White Council? Because that was, you know, okay, it's just a comment that it happens later, but inevitably he had to put that into his version of The Hobbit. I think it would have been a very different film if Guillermo del Toro, who was originally going to be the director, had directed it. Yeah. And I think it would have been a film that could have stood completely on its own and not been, you know, sort of tied into The Lord of the Rings, and probably would have had maybe greater success. So I think it was a really difficult project. I didn't find it as much fun writing the books because there was less freedom for me to be able to get stuck in. But that was mainly because I think the films themselves were developed in such a problematic way. Originally there were going to be 2 movies, and then work got sort of held up and things happened, and then it moved to 3 movies, and, you know, nobody was, for a long time, I mean, a lot of people have written off The Hobbit as being something which is just down to the greed of the film studio of wanting to push the thing to 3 films in order to make the most money. Personally, I don't believe that is the truth. I believe the truth is that the technology that they were trying to embrace was so advanced that they really could not control the story that as well as they should be able to done, because they had to allow more time for CGI and all the special effects, and they kind of ran out of time, and so they had to bring the first part of the Hobbit to a close, which was much sooner than it would have been had it been 2 films, and then it was inevitable that they wouldn't get the rest into one film, and then it became a trilogy. The downside of the trilogy format, apart from people saying it's a tiny book, so why did it need 3 films, which many people have said in a kind of cross kind of way. The other downside to it is that the story doesn't have the dramatic, to my mind, doesn't have the dramatic weight to carry it through 3 films. And there was too much elaboration on elements which frankly could have just been passed over. But it's easy to talk about why films aren't as great as they should be afterwards, because in my experience, every filmmaker, every writer, every musician, every poet, whatever people are doing, they intend what they do to be the best that they can do. Nobody sets out to make a dumb movie or a bad book. They don't. Nobody sets out to make a rubbish painting. You set out to do the best you can, and then between that wanting to do the best you can and doing what comes out at the end, things can go a bit haywire. And they're not as good. Sometimes, as we well know, with lots of books, lots of pieces of art, and indeed many films films that failed abysmally then turn out to be a great success later. One of my favourite films is Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. One of the great Christmas films that everybody adores, Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed and all that wonderful stuff with the angel, looks after him and so on. And he, now that film, when that film opened in the cinemas, despite having Jimmy Stewart, who was, a great popular actor, he didn't do very well at all. That film only became one of the great Christmas highlights of everybody's television by people watching it over and over again on TV. So, you never know that films, Fantasia, Walt Disney's Fantasia, which, bombed at the box office in 1940, but that film then becomes a classic now, so one has to just bear in mind that what is today's failure can well be tomorrow's big success.
Thank you for that insight. I think it's really interesting, because what many fans say, what you say, to put one book into 3 movies, I think, yes, 2 would have been enough in my opinion, or 1 well done, depending on how it's done, but it's not my position to choose or to what I think strikes me is the amazing author Tolkien, that he has created the Hobbit book, but he has also written down in the appendices in his next book, in the Lord of the Rings, what Gandalf has been doing in the meantime. And it's not included in the book The Hobbit as such, but you can, as a filmmaker or adapter in whatever way, you can fill up the gaps because it's been told in a different story. And that's what I find amazing about that project, that you are able to include the White Council because you know what's going on there, even if it's not in the original book. And that's what I think is a great approach, the way how they did it well.
Yeah, I accept that absolutely. I think my question would be that if we were able to take the whole context of what happens from the point when Gandalf leaves the dwarves on the edge of Mirkwood until he returns, if one was able to deal with that in the kind of way that the Lord of the Rings deals with it, I'm talking now not about the filmmaking, I'm talking about in the sense of drama and the importance of what's going on and the weight of history. I think if one could have done that, but done it with a material in the rest of the story that had the same weight of importance. I think the difficulty with The Hobbit is in some ways it's quite lightweight, and I think that for example, what got lost to me in the making of The Hobbit was the humour and some of the humour and fun of the dwarves and the dwarves' exploits and Bilbo's exploits, simply because it was now being expected to carry all the kind of significance that is in the Lord of the Rings. So I think it plays both ways. And yes, but what you were saying, in essence, I'm absolutely intrigued by. I'm always intrigued by the way in which Tolkien worked, and the fact that it was for him a journey in telling these stories, because unlike most novelists, this is, I think, why the book is so important, that both books, but The Lord of the Rings in particular, is because he did not know when he wrote those opening chapters, he did not know where that story was going. Now, no novelist today wanting to get a book published would write a letter to a publisher with an outline which said, this is how it starts, I don't know how it finishes. No publisher would even give you they wouldn't give you £1 for your possibilities. So that's what's extraordinary. 2 things are extraordinary. One, that's how he created the book, really travelling this journey, and it's also, of course, how remarkable that the publisher took a gamble on what was a book which was written by somebody who was absolutely not a novelist in this true sense of what that word usually means when we think of writers like Thomas Hardy or Charles Dickens or Jane Austen or whatever. So I find those elements really interesting, that Tolkien was just making this journey of discovery, and I really believe that's why the book has this hold on people. Mm-hmm. I think whenever you find a book that was just created in a moment in some cases, but in Tolkien's case across many years, but it's something that's come out of the creation of the author without him or her having sat there saying, chapter 1, this is what happens, then chapter 2, there's the bank heist, and then chapter 3, there's the flight to Rome, and then there's the meeting with the Vatican, and then we fly off to Russia, and we meet without having any plan, really, just travelling the journey. When books like that are created, they live in people's imaginations because you somehow pick up on this visceral uncertainty that the author's going through of what happens next. I mean, I would compare it, couldn't be more different in many ways, but I would compare it with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, where that story was told on a riverboat, on a little rowboat, going up the Thames by the Reverend Charles Dodson, also known later as Lewis Carroll, to the 3 daughters of the Dean of Christ Church in Oxford. And there's an account of this river trip on the 4th of July, 1862. And the other person who was in the boat with them was a colleague of Lewis Carroll's. And he described it later and said, I looked back over my shoulder, he was rowing, I looked back over my shoulder and I said to Dodson, are you making this up as you go along? and he said yes, he was extemporizing this story from scratch. And that's why Alice's Adventures in Wonderland really catches people's imagination, because yes, of course, it took him another year to write it down for Alice, but it came into his mind out of nowhere. It was just something that was there in his head. And if you compare it with Through the Looking Glass, the sequel, you'll see that Through the Looking Glass is a very polished, refined book that he structured and worked out what he was going to do, but it doesn't have that moment of kind of inspiration. And that's what I find in The Lord of the Rings, that the fact that Tolkien would write to friends or to his son and say, that the hobbits have arrived in Bree and they've just met this character called Ryder, and I don't quite know what's going to happen next or who he is. The fact that he didn't know is what pulls you into the story and makes you care and want to find out what that next bit of the story is.
I think that that's something that's really sensible in your BBC radio adaptation. I think that's one of the really greatest adaptations, in my opinion.
Thank you.
There's another radio adaptation in German from, I think it's the 70s, which is also really great. Could you maybe say a little how that came to be, how you were involved in all of that?
I was a very ambitious young writer. I was in my 20s, and I had done a very short dramatisation for the BBC in London of a book by a writer, American writer called James Thurber. It's a little fantasy. It's called The Wonderful O. It's a nice little story, actually. It's a fantastic little story about an island where some very bad people come to it, and in order to get them to reveal the secret of where their treasure is hidden, I won't spoil the story because what their treasure is revealed right at the end of the story, but they take away from the people their right to use the letter O, and so all words that have got O in them are forbidden, and that the way that impacts on them, so they can't have books about Robin Hood, for example, or any other title that's got lots of O's in it. They could have had The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings. Anyway, and I wanted to do some more. And in those days, the BBC really were very different to the way they are as a corporation now. And they said to me, what else would you like to do? Would you like to do something else? And I sent them lots of ideas which didn't match up with what they wanted to do. But I then suggested The Lord of the Rings, and I didn't know this was the case. Otherwise I'd probably been too frightened to have suggested it, actually. But they were actually at that point trying to find out whether they could get the radio rights to do The Lord of the Rings. And that just happened to play well for me. And they took a great gamble on this really very, very inexperienced writer. And the first thing I had to do was to rearrange Tolkien's book. Tolkien would have hated it because he really did believe that the only way the book should be treated was to deal with it as he had written it. So after the breaking of the Fellowship, you have 2 or 3 chapters with Frodo, Sam and Gollum, and then you have 3 or 4 chapters with the hunters, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, and then you have Merry and Pippin with Fangorn and so on. So it cuts back and forth, and then you go back to Frodo and Gollum and Sam and what they're doing. And I knew that wouldn't work in what was a 30-minute episode once a week. So the book had to be restructured so that you knew all the time what were Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli doing, and what were Frodo, Sam and Gollum doing, and how they matched up. Now, fortunately, Tolkien was very thorough in dating everything in one of the appendices. So you get hints in the book where Frodo would look at the moon and see that it was a full moon or half a moon, and the same moment at a later point in the book, Aragorn, maybe standing on the in front of Edoras, would look up and see the same phase of the moon, and that's how you sort of knew the continuity. But I had to restructure every episode so that all these characters were all kept alive and part of the action. That was quite tough. And then 26 episodes. I was very fortunate. They matched me up with a very experienced writer called Michael Bakewell, who had dramatised War and Peace, and he and I then wrote 13 episodes each. It took the whole of this process took 6 months, and then there was another 4 months of recording it. So it was a major enterprise at the BBC.
Wow.
And to get the chance to do that as a young guy who had done practically nothing it was just amazing. Scary. It was scary and wonderful all at the same time.
But that's exactly Tolkien, I think. It's beautiful and scary all the way through till the end.
That's very perceptive, yes, I think that's right, yeah.
Christina Skull, she talked very, very fondly of your BBC radio adaptation too. She said it was really important, striking moment in her life to carry on with the Lord of the Rings.
I find that a couple of people here, since we've been in this conference, a couple of people have come up to me and told me very particular personal stories about how much it has meant to them in their lives, which I find incredibly moving. To be totally honest about how I felt about it over the years, there was a time shortly after The Lord of the Rings, I loved all the attention I got as a result, if I'm honest. But then I started doing lots of other things. I adapted a lot of other things. But every time I did anything, it would be referred to as being by Brian Sibley, who had dramatised The Lord of the Rings. Mm-hmm. And I got very... I used to get a bit sort of annoyed about that, because I was thinking, well, I've done this and I've done that. I did a dramatisation of Mervyn Peake's Titus Groan and Gormenghast, which won a major award, and everybody still talked about it as being by the man who dramatised The Lord of the Rings. And there was a period of time when I used to feel, but I've done this, I've done Mervyn Peake, and I've done this, I've done the whole of the Chronicles of Narnia, and you don't mention that, but you mentioned The Lord of the Rings. Well, that was very immature of me, I now realise, and there came a point when I actually realised that I had been lucky enough to be part of something that was unique and happily very, very special, and is beloved by people. And the more I've learnt about the influence that I've had on people without even knowing it, and of course I only know the people I meet or I hear from or I have contact with, that is so humbling in a way, that now I'm very, very happy to wear the badge of being the man who did it. But I do always say at the same time that it isn't just my badge, because it's a badge that is shared by all those actors, by Michael as my colleague in writing, by the producers, by the composer and the musicians. So it's a mass achievement by a whole bunch of people who really were doing their own little journey, actually. For best part, all told, of nearly a year, travelling from the moment when they asked me to start the work through to the day when we finished the series and it was in the can, as they say. That was best part of a year, and that was a journey too. And the fact that it's lived on is something of which I really am, as I'm sure everybody connected with it is. I'm really very proud, and to know that it will it will be there as long as we have ways of listening to it anyway.
I think it's really a great work also it amazes me how you adapted the story to feel, to not have book Frodo and Sam, and then book the other, because when I first read The Lord of the Rings, I got pretty much fed up with that, to be honest, because I couldn't wait to see. I wanted to know what my other friends were doing just right now.
Exactly.
And that was the first encounter with how this story should have been told. That was my opinion on the BBC.
Indeed. And if you look at a modern successful writer, let's look at J.K. Rowling, for example, in Harry Potter. My partner always says that the secret of Rowling's writing is that every chapter is actually a chapter and a half, because halfway through a chapter you suddenly come to some great turning point in the story, and it says end of chapter, and of course you've got to read the next one. And most writers nowadays, a writer like, say, I don't know, almost any popular novelist would actually say that's an absurd way to construct a book. But for Tolkien it was right. I hope if could have heard it, the radio series, of course he'd have had complaints about it, I know, but I hope if he'd heard it and he'd realised that it worked in that way, by cutting back and forth between the characters, that it had its own drama and intensity because of it, and you care so much because you know what's happening at Helm's Deep, and you know what's happening to Sam and Frodo, where they are. When you get to Mount Doom, and that the others are before the Black Gate, and that there's Sam and Frodo and Gollum, almost at the crack of doom, and the tension of what happens when the Black Gates open, all of that, that intensity of the drama, that you've got those two enormous events happening simultaneously. It's powerful. It's powerful stuff.
Yes, it really is. I mentioned Christina Skull before. She gave you the real badge you're wearing from the Tolkien Society, right?
No, the badge I'm wearing now, which is the
it's the golden one,
the
isn't
Society's
it?
gold badge. The premium one. And I think it was probably a bit later, but I was made an honorary member of the Tolkien Society, which is a great honour. But the badge was presented to me by Priscilla Tolkien.
So I mixed that up. Wow.
No, you've only done. But I remember Priscilla. Priscilla loved the Tolkien Society, and she, was. I mean, obviously she's Tolkien's daughter and the sister to Christopher Tolkien, and she always, when she was well enough, she used to be able to attend Tolkien events, and she thought that was a major event for her. And I can remember, I think it was 1982, and I went to Oxon Moot, which is the meeting they have annually in Oxford, and it was at the Turf Tavern, which has a kind of courtyard, if I remember rightly. And Priscilla was there, and she was very much like the kind of the queen of the event, and it was a little bit like in Britain when our queen gives honours to people. There's a thing called an investiture, where they have to come up and kneel before the Queen, and she's knighting them, she strikes their shoulders with the sword, or she pins on them whatever the badge is that they're getting. Well, it was a little bit like that with Priscilla, actually, because I actually felt, well, here I am, I'm being given this honour by somebody who is a member of the Tolkien family. It's her dad who wrote this book. So that was a fantastic moment for me, and and I'm hugely proud of being part of this society.
Wow, I can't even begin to imagine what that must have felt like. Last question, Brian. If there would be a possibility for you to talk to Tolkien, or maybe write him a letter or whatever, to get in touch with him, what would be something that you would like to ask him or tell him or say or whatever?
Well, I did write him a letter when I was a young man. I wrote him a out-and-out fan letter. I put runes all the way around the edge of the letter, the page that I was writing on, handwritten letter. I suspect I just copied them off the front of The Hobbit. I wrote a passage in Elvish. I'm not sure whether it was Sindarin or Tenwa. I'm not sure what it was. Anyway, I wrote him a letter and I asked him to sign a copy of Tom Bombadil, which is another book that I loved. And he very kindly signed it and corrected a mistake in the text for me. So if I could write him a letter today, however, well, what would I ask? I'd ask his forgiveness for having left things out and changed some things and not done it quite the way that he might have liked it to have happened. So I hope he would forgive me for that. If I could say anything else, and I think I probably said something along these lines when I first wrote to him, it would be to thank him for what he has given me, what his books have given me, and that in two senses. First, as the personal pleasure that he's given to me, the enjoyment of being able to share in that world of Middle-earth, but also the opportunities that he's opened up for me in my own work, to write books, to make the programs. So I'd like to say thank you, and sorry if I didn't get it all quite right, Professor, but my heart was in the right place. I meant to do it properly. I meant to do it the best I can, and thank you for having created something that's been, for so many years now, from, well, when I first read The Hobbit, aged 11 or 12, has been so much and is still a lot of my personal life. So thank you, Professor.
Oh, that's really emotional. Thank you, Brian, for taking your time for the interview, for all of your thorough answers. But thank you for what you did to the community. Thank you for the BBC adaptation. Thank you for the books. You've put so much heart into it. Thank you for being here and sharing your time with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed our interview. TolkCast is a podcast by the German Tolkien Society, and the regular episodes are in German. To get to the podcast, just follow the link in the description. Should you be interested in translating this interview into your native tongue, we're more than happy to share a transcript with you. Just contact us. You can find the address in the description. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for our next Tolkienian adventure.